The moment my mother looked away while my brother untied the boat, I realized I had never really been part of my own family. The sun was dropping low over the Gulf waters when I understood they were actually leaving me there. Not joking. Not teaching me some strange lesson. Leaving me. The little stretch of sand beneath my feet couldn't have been more than a quarter-mile wide, surrounded by shallow blue water and patches of sharp rock that cut through the tide like broken glass. I stood there barefoot, my white linen pants soaked to my knees, watching my 42-foot fishing boat drift farther into the orange horizon while my younger brother Ryan kept his hands on the wheel like he owned it already. My father sat beside him without saying a word. And my mother never once turned around. At 67 years old, I thought I understood betrayal. I thought I understood loneliness too. My husband Walter died 8 years ago after 36 years of marriage, and ever since then, people treated me differently. Friends disappeared. Family only called when they needed something. But nothing prepared me for the feeling of watching your own blood sail away while you stood stranded on a forgotten island somewhere off the Florida Keys. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was realizing this had probably been planned before we ever left the marina. 3 days earlier, my mother Linda had called me sounding sweeter than she had in years. "Your father's birthday means a lot to him this year," she told me. "He wants the whole family together on your boat one last time." One last time. I should have noticed how carefully she chose those words. My boat, the Blue Heron, was the only thing in my life I had built completely on my own. Walter and I bought her secondhand 20 years ago, restoring her piece by piece until she became the pride of our little marina outside Sarasota. After he passed, that boat became more than property. It became proof that I could still survive alone. Ryan hated that. My brother spent most of his life bouncing between failed business ideas, unpaid debts, and excuses that somehow always became everyone else's responsibility. At 62 years old, he still blamed the world for problems he created himself. But our parents defended him constantly. "Ryan just needs one good opportunity," my mother would always say. Meanwhile, I was the selfish daughter because I refused to bankroll another disaster. Looking back now, I can see the signs started the moment we left the dock that morning. Ryan kept asking questions about the boat's insurance. My father wanted to know whether my will had been updated recently. Even my mother kept making strange comments about how exhausting it must be for a woman my age to maintain something so expensive alone. At first, I ignored it. Families say strange things sometimes. Especially older families carrying decades of quiet resentment beneath polite conversations. But by the second day of the trip, the pressure became impossible to miss. Ryan started openly joking that the Blue Heron should stay in the family after I was gone someday. Then he stopped joking entirely. That night over grilled snapper and cheap wine under the deck lights, my brother leaned back in his chair and smiled at me like we were discussing the weather. "You should just sign the boat over to me now," he said casually. "Before something happens." I remember laughing at first because the idea sounded ridiculous. But nobody else laughed. Not my father. Not my mother. The only sound was the slow crash of water against the hull while my mother folded her napkin carefully and said the words I still hear in my nightmares. "Family should take care of family, Evelyn." I stared at my mother across the dinner table, waiting for her to smile and tell me Ryan was joking, but she only reached for her wineglass and took a slow sip while the deck lights reflected in her eyes like tiny pieces of broken glass. My father cleared his throat and folded his hands together the same way he used to before delivering bad news when I was a little girl. "Nobody is trying to upset you, Evelyn," he said carefully. "We are talking about the future." I remember feeling something cold settle into my chest right then because families do not talk about your future like you are already gone unless they have been discussing it behind your back for a long time. Ryan leaned forward in his chair, smelling faintly of sunscreen and bourbon, wearing that smug expression he always had whenever he believed somebody else was about to pay for his problems. "Look," he said, "you have had the boat for 20 years. Dad is getting older. Mom is getting older. You barely take it out anymore. It makes sense to keep it with someone who can actually use it. I almost laughed at the stupidity of that statement because Ryan had never successfully maintained anything in his entire life. 2 ex-wives, 3 bankrupt businesses, unpaid marina fees in Tampa, and somehow he still carried himself like the misunderstood genius of the family. "You mean someone who can sell it," I replied calmly. His jaw tightened immediately. My mother finally spoke. "There is no reason to be cruel." Cruel. That word almost stunned me more than the conversation itself. For years my family had treated my stability like a personal insult. I worked 40 years managing financial records at a marina office while Ryan chased one ridiculous dream after another. Walter and I skipped vacations to restore the blue heron ourselves. We spent weekends repainting the hull under the Florida sun while Ryan borrowed money from our parents to buy motorcycles he never kept longer than 6 months. But somehow I was the selfish one because I protected what I earned. "I am not signing over my boat," I said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Silence settled across the deck. Even the ocean seemed quieter. My father rubbed his forehead with visible frustration while my mother stared at me with disappointment so sharp it almost felt rehearsed. Ryan laughed under his breath and leaned back again. "You always think everything belongs to you," he muttered. I looked directly at him. "Because I paid for it." That should have ended the conversation. In normal families, it would have. But the atmosphere changed after that dinner in a way I still cannot fully explain. Nobody yelled. Nobody argued openly. It became worse than anger. It became coldness. My mother stopped speaking to me unless necessary. My father disappeared into silence. Ryan walked around my own boat like he was inspecting property he expected to inherit soon. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of low voices outside my cabin window. At first I thought it was fishermen passing nearby, but then I recognized Ryan's voice. "She will never agree willingly," he whispered. I froze beneath the thin cotton sheet while my heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then my mother answered quietly, "Just keep your temper under control until we get there." Get where? Those 3 words kept echoing inside my head as I climbed out of bed and looked through the small cabin window toward the back deck. The moment my mother noticed me watching, the conversation stopped instantly. I spent the next hour pretending everything felt normal while my stomach twisted tighter with every passing minute. My mother moved around the galley making coffee without looking directly at me. My father sat near the bow reading the same page of his fishing magazine over and over again. Ryan acted cheerful in a way that felt forced, like a salesman trying too hard to close a deal. The ocean around us was calm that morning, flat blue water stretching endlessly beneath a pale Florida sky, but inside that boat the tension had become unbearable. I kept replaying the conversation I overheard outside my cabin. "Until we get there." The words would not leave my head. Around 8 o'clock, Ryan suddenly clapped his hands together and announced that he found a small island nearby where we could stop for lunch and take pictures for Dad's birthday. "There is an old supply dock there," he said. "Could be fun to explore." I looked at the navigation screen mounted near the wheel. The island was barely marked on the map, just a narrow strip of sand and brush nearly 12 miles from the nearest marina. "Nobody stops there," I said quietly. Ryan shrugged. "Exactly. Private beach." My father finally looked up from his magazine. "Sounds nice to me." My mother smiled for the first time all morning. "Your father deserves one good family memory." Something about the way she said family memory sent a chill through me. Still, I told myself I was overthinking everything. Maybe the strange mood came from money stress. Maybe Ryan had been drinking too much again. Families become complicated with age. I tried convincing myself this trip could still be salvaged if I stayed calm. By late morning we reached the island. It looked even smaller up close, with clusters of dry grass growing between pale rocks and a few twisted mangrove trees bending toward the water. There were no houses, no docks, no signs of tourists. Just silence and heat rising off the sand. Ryan killed the engines and grabbed a small cooler. "Come help me check the shoreline," he said. "Dad wants some pictures near the rocks." I hesitated. "Why not all of us go together?" "Mom wants to stay on the boat," Ryan answered quickly. "Dad is tired too." My father avoided eye contact again. That was when alarm truly started building in my chest. I should have refused right there. I know that now. But part of me still wanted to believe my family could not possibly be capable of what my instincts were warning me about. I stepped carefully off the boat into ankle-deep water, carrying the cooler while Ryan followed behind me toward the beach. The sand felt hot beneath my bare feet as gulls circled overhead. For a few minutes nothing happened. Ryan pointed toward the far side of the island and pretended to look for shells while I stood there confused and uneasy. Then I heard it. The low hum of engines starting behind me. I turned around instantly. The blue heron was already pulling away from shore. At first my brain refused to process what I was seeing. "Ryan," I said sharply, "tell Dad to stop the boat." But Ryan only stood there with his hands in his pockets watching the water. "You should have shared, Evelyn," he said quietly. And then he walked backward toward the edge of the island while my mother sat motionless near the stern of my boat, refusing to look at me as the distance between us grew wider and wider. I think part of me still believed they would come back for nearly an hour. That is the embarrassing truth I do not like admitting. Even after Ryan climbed back onto the boat and the blue heron disappeared farther into open water, I kept standing there under the blazing noon sun telling myself this had to be some cruel misunderstanding. Maybe they wanted to scare me. Maybe Ryan was angry and my parents would talk sense into him. Maybe they would circle back once everybody calmed down. But deep inside, another voice kept whispering something colder. They planned this. The silence around me felt enormous once the engines disappeared completely. No music. No voices. No movement except waves brushing against the shore and the distant cry of gulls overhead. The island smelled like salt, hot sand, and dried seaweed baking beneath the Florida heat. I shaded my eyes and scanned the horizon again, hoping to catch sight of the boat turning around. Nothing. Just endless blue water in every direction. I looked down at what I still had with me. One small cooler containing bottled water, 2 turkey sandwiches, and a bag of potato chips. My phone. My sunglasses. That was all. My stomach tightened as I reached into my pocket and checked the phone screen. No signal. Of course there was no signal. Ryan knew these waters well enough to choose a dead zone. That realization hit me harder than anything else so far because it proved this was never spontaneous. He had planned every detail carefully. I started pacing along the shoreline trying to stay calm while my thoughts spiraled faster and faster. What exactly did they expect to happen to me out there? Were they planning to return after a few hours? Were they trying to force me into giving up the boat? Or had my family genuinely convinced themselves that abandoning a 67-year-old woman on an isolated island was somehow acceptable because they felt entitled to what belonged to her? Every possibility sounded insane. Yet the empty horizon kept reminding me this was real. Around mid-afternoon clouds began drifting across the sky, blocking the sun in uneven patches. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the sharp smell of rain somewhere in the distance. I walked deeper into the island searching for anything useful. The center was mostly tangled brush and crooked mangrove roots pushing through pale sand. Lizards darted between rocks as I moved carefully through the heat. Then I found something unexpected near the far side of the island. Half hidden beneath overgrown brush stood a weathered wooden structure no bigger than a garden shed. Its roof sagged badly, and one side leaned toward the ground like it had survived years of storms, but it was standing. I pushed the warped door open slowly. Inside I found old fishing supplies, rusted hooks, faded rope, a broken lantern, and most importantly, a dusty orange emergency water container sitting against the wall. Relief nearly brought tears to my eyes for the first time all day. Somebody had once used this island during storms or fishing trips. That meant survival here was possible. I sat down heavily on an overturned crate and finally allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding since the moment the blue heron vanished. My family had not just betrayed me. They had removed me from their lives as if I were an inconvenience standing between them and something they wanted. And the most painful part was realizing this feeling had probably existed inside them for years while I kept pretending we were still a family. The storm rolled in just after sunset. One minute the sky above the gulf was streaked pink and gold, and the next it turned dark gray so quickly it felt like somebody had pulled a curtain across the horizon. The wind rattled the old fishing shed while waves crashed harder against the rocks surrounding the island. I sat on the dusty wooden floor hugging my knees, listening to thunder somewhere far out over the water, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt truly alone in the world. Not lonely. Alone. There is a difference. Loneliness still leaves hope that somebody cares about you somewhere. But sitting there in that crumbling shack while rain hammered the roof above me, I realized the people I spent my whole life protecting had deliberately erased me from theirs. My mother used to tell everyone I was the dependable child. The responsible one. The strong one. It sounds flattering until you realize dependable people are often treated like objects instead of human beings. Ryan failed over and over again because our parents believed somebody else would always clean up behind him. Usually that somebody was me. I paid his overdue mortgage once after his second divorce because my father begged me to help. I covered hospital bills when my mother needed surgery that insurance would not fully handle. I even gave Ryan a job at the marina years ago until he stopped showing up sober enough to work safely around customers. Every sacrifice I made became invisible the moment I stopped giving them what they wanted. The rain intensified outside, leaking through cracks in the old roof. I used an empty plastic bucket to catch water while lightning flashed over the ocean in bright white bursts. The humidity felt thick enough to choke on, and my wet clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin. Still, survival instincts slowly pushed panic aside. I inventoried everything inside the shack carefully. Fishing line. A rusted tackle box. A faded emergency blanket sealed in plastic. 2 old flares tucked beneath a shelf. Whoever abandoned this place years ago had accidentally given me a chance. I forced myself to think practically instead of emotionally. That was something Walter taught me during hurricane season back when we restored the blue heron together. Fear wastes energy, he used to say. Focus keeps you alive. I repeated those words quietly to myself while organizing supplies by lantern light. Around midnight the storm finally began drifting north, leaving behind heavy wind and rough surf. I stepped outside carefully and stared across the black water. Somewhere beyond that darkness, my family was probably sleeping comfortably inside my boat. The thought made something inside me harden in a way I had never experienced before. Not rage. Something colder. Clarity. I suddenly understood that if I survived this island, nothing between me and my family would ever return to normal again. The woman who boarded that boat in Sarasota believing loyalty still mattered no longer existed. My parents had chosen Ryan over me one final time, except this time the betrayal was too large to excuse away with polite silence and family dinners. I sat near the shoreline until dawn watching weak gray light slowly rise over the ocean, and when the first sunlight touched the water, I made myself a promise. If I got off that island alive, I would never allow any of them to control another piece of my life again. The second day on the island changed me more than the previous 67 years of my life combined. By morning the storm had passed completely, leaving the sky bright and painfully clear above the water. Heat rose off the sand in heavy waves, and the air smelled fresh again, almost peaceful if somebody ignored the fact that I had been abandoned there by my own family. I barely slept the night before. Every sound outside the shack kept jolting me awake because part of my mind still hoped I would hear boat engines returning for me. But sunrise came with nothing except gulls circling overhead and endless empty water. I forced myself into routine because routine keeps panic under control. I rationed the remaining bottled water carefully, checked the fishing supplies again, and walked the perimeter of the island looking for anything useful. Near the north side, I found remnants of an old emergency marker half buried beneath sand and driftwood. The metal pole was rusted badly, but attached to it was a cracked plastic case containing faded orange distress flags. Whoever once maintained this island had clearly stopped years ago, yet those forgotten supplies suddenly felt like proof that survival depended more on patience than luck. Around noon I climbed the highest rocky area on the island and scanned the horizon again. That was when I finally saw movement in the distance. A small white vessel moved slowly across the water several miles away, barely visible beneath the bright sun. My heart started pounding so hard I nearly slipped climbing back down the rocks. I grabbed one of the old distress flags and ran toward the shoreline, waving it wildly despite knowing the boat was probably too far away to notice me. For several minutes I shouted until my throat burned dry, but the vessel continued moving steadily across open water without changing direction. Watching it disappear nearly broke something inside me. I sat down heavily in the wet sand, exhausted and humiliated by my own desperation. That was when another realization hit me. If nobody had reported me missing yet, then my family had probably already created their own version of this story. Ryan was not careless enough to abandon me without preparing excuses first. I could practically hear my mother speaking in that worried, gentle tone she used whenever she wanted sympathy from strangers. Evelyn has not been herself lately. The thought made my stomach turn. They would not admit what they had done. They would paint me as unstable, confused, emotional, maybe even reckless enough to disappear voluntarily. Suddenly every strange question my father asked about my will and finances made terrifying sense. By late afternoon the heat became almost unbearable. My skin burned despite hiding beneath the emergency blanket during the hottest hours, and I could feel exhaustion creeping deeper into my body. Still, somewhere beneath the fear and anger, another emotion was growing stronger. Determination. My family expected me to panic. They expected weakness. They expected the dependable daughter to finally collapse quietly so they could take whatever remained of her life. But sitting there alone beside the Gulf water, I realized surviving this island might become the first truly selfish thing I had ever done for myself. As sunset approached again, I carefully arranged driftwood near the shoreline and prepared one of the emergency flares beside it in case another vessel passed during the night. Then I sat quietly facing the darkening horizon, no longer praying my family would come back. Instead, I began hoping they believed I would never return. The rescue happened on the third morning just after sunrise, and by then I had already stopped expecting kindness from anyone. I was standing near the shoreline adjusting the pile of driftwood I had prepared for smoke signals when I heard the faint sound of engines somewhere beyond the eastern rocks. At first I thought exhaustion was making me imagine things again, but then a white Coast Guard vessel appeared around the edge of the island, cutting steadily through the water. I grabbed the orange distress flag and started waving it with every ounce of strength left in my body. This time the boat changed direction immediately. I do not think I have ever felt relief that powerful before. 2 officers stepped onto the beach a few minutes later asking if I was injured and whether I needed medical attention. I remember one of them staring at me with visible confusion when I explained that my family had abandoned me there. He exchanged a quick glance with the younger officer before helping me onto the boat carefully. The cabin smelled like coffee, sunscreen, and engine fuel. Normal smells. Safe smells. For the first time in days, I felt my body begin relaxing enough to shake uncontrollably from exhaustion. One of the officers handed me bottled water while the other radioed information back to the station. Then his expression changed slightly as he listened through the headset. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "your family already reported you missing yesterday evening." I stared at him in disbelief. "Missing?" "Yes, ma'am. They told authorities you became emotionally distressed during the trip and disappeared after an argument." The words hit me harder than the island itself. Emotionally distressed. Of course that was the story. Ryan and my parents had not only abandoned me. They prepared a narrative designed to destroy my credibility before I was even rescued. The officer continued speaking gently, probably believing he was comforting me. "Your mother sounded very concerned on the report. Concerned. I nearly laughed out loud. By the time we reached the marina near Key West later that afternoon, I already understood exactly what I was walking into. My family stood waiting near the dock surrounded by local deputies and marina staff. My mother rushed toward me first with tears streaming down her face while Ryan stood behind her looking tense but controlled. "Oh my God, Evelyn," she cried dramatically. We were terrified. I stepped back before she could hug me. The sudden silence around the dock felt sharp enough to cut through steel. My father avoided looking directly at me while Ryan crossed his arms defensively. "You disappeared," Ryan said quickly. "You wandered off while everybody was sleeping." The calmness in his voice terrified me more than shouting ever could have. He had rehearsed this. All of them had. I looked directly at the deputies standing nearby. "That is not true," I said clearly. "My family left me on that island intentionally." My mother immediately started crying harder. "Please do not upset her further," she whispered toward the officers. "She has been struggling since losing her husband." There it was. The widow card. The unstable older woman narrative. Suddenly years of small insults and dismissive comments snapped together in my mind like puzzle pieces. They had spent a long time preparing people not to trust my voice. One deputy asked if there was any proof supporting either version of events. Ryan answered immediately before I could speak. "She has been confused lately," he said. "We were trying to help her." Help me. Standing there under the blazing Florida sun while strangers studied my face with uncertainty, I realized my family had not simply betrayed me physically. They were trying to erase me socially too. I did not scream at them on the dock. I did not cry either. That seemed to confuse my family more than anything else. My mother kept reaching toward me with trembling hands while Ryan stood there performing concern for the deputies, but I simply walked past all of them and asked one of the Coast Guard officers for a ride to the nearest hotel. The silence behind me felt heavy and uncomfortable. They expected emotional collapse. Instead, I gave them distance. Over the next 3 days, my family called constantly. My mother left tearful voicemails asking me to come home so we can fix this misunderstanding. Ryan sent long text messages claiming everybody panicked after I disappeared from the island and that I was twisting events because of stress. My father only called once. He left a message saying, "You are hurting your mother by dragging this out." That voicemail told me everything I needed to know. Even after abandoning me, they still saw themselves as victims. I rented a small room near the marina in Sarasota and spent most of the week quietly rebuilding the timeline in my head. Every strange conversation. Every financial question. Every uncomfortable silence during that trip. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. This had never been about concern for me. It was about control. On Friday morning, I visited the marina office where I had worked for nearly 4 decades. Most of the staff still knew me well, and the manager, Carla Benson, nearly cried when she heard what happened. "Evelyn, your brother came by here 2 weeks ago asking questions about your insurance paperwork," she told me quietly. "He said you wanted help transferring ownership records." My stomach turned cold instantly. "Did he access anything?" Carla shook her head. "Absolutely not. But he seemed desperate." Desperate. That word stayed with me the rest of the day. By evening I decided to contact an attorney named Michael Grayson, a calm gray-haired man specializing in financial fraud and elder exploitation cases. I hated even using that phrase because it made me sound weak, but Michael listened carefully without interrupting while I explained everything from the boat conversations to the false missing person report. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair thoughtfully and asked one simple question. "Mrs. Carter, has anyone besides you accessed your financial records recently?" I immediately remembered something I had ignored months earlier. A strange notification from my bank about attempted login activity. At the time I assumed it was random fraud and changed my passwords without thinking much about it. Michael requested copies of my banking records, insurance accounts, and property files immediately. 2 days later, He called me back sounding far more serious than before. "You need to come in," he said. Sitting across from his desk Monday morning, I watched him slide several printed documents toward me. My signature appeared on all of them. Except I had never signed any of them. Temporary power of attorney forms. Asset transfer authorizations. Marina ownership inquiries. Every document connected directly back to Ryan. My hands actually trembled turning the pages because the signatures looked frighteningly convincing. Michael tapped one paper carefully. "These were submitted electronically from a home computer registered to your parents' address." I stared down at the forged paperwork while a strange calm settled over me again. Not shock anymore. Certainty. They had not abandoned me impulsively during some family argument. My family fully intended to take control of my assets after discrediting me publicly. And suddenly I understood why Ryan looked so nervous on that dock when I came back alive. 3 weeks later, my mother invited the entire family to Sunday dinner like nothing had happened. The message arrived through text at exactly 9:14 in the morning. "We should all sit down together and move forward peacefully." Peacefully. I stared at those words for a long time before finally smiling for the first time since the island. Because by then, I already had everything I needed. My attorney had gathered copies of the forged documents, electronic submission records tied to my parents' home internet, marina security footage showing Ryan asking about ownership transfers weeks before the trip, and Coast Guard timing reports proving the route they gave authorities did not match the actual location where I was found. More importantly, Michael uncovered Ryan's financial records through the civil investigation process. My brother was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out. Gambling loans. A second mortgage hidden from our parents. The truth was almost pathetic in its predictability. Ryan did not want my boat because he loved it. He needed money desperately, and my parents were willing to sacrifice me to save the son they spent their entire lives protecting from consequences. Sunday evening arrived warm and humid like most Florida nights. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it had for 30 years. White shutters. Perfect lawn. Wind chimes near the porch. The kind of home people associate with safety and family. I parked quietly across the street for a moment before walking inside carrying a single leather folder beneath my arm. The moment I entered the dining room, conversation stopped. Ryan sat near the end of the table drinking iced tea while my mother forced an anxious smile onto her face. "Evelyn," she said softly, "we are so glad you came." I took my seat calmly. Nobody touched their food. My father looked older than I remembered, his shoulders bent slightly beneath the dining room light. For several minutes my mother rambled about misunderstandings, family healing, and how painful the past few weeks had been for everyone. Then Ryan finally leaned forward impatiently. "Can we stop acting like this was attempted murder or something?" he snapped. "You got rescued. You are fine." Fine. That single word erased the last trace of guilt I still carried. I opened the leather folder slowly and placed several documents onto the table one by one. "These are the forged transfer forms submitted from your house," I said calmly. Nobody moved. Ryan's face lost color immediately. I placed another stack beside them. "These are your debt records." Then another. "And these are statements from the marina employees you questioned before the trip." My mother's hands began trembling violently. "Evelyn," she whispered, "please." But I was not finished. I looked directly at my father. "You asked about my will because you already knew Ryan planned to take everything once I was declared mentally unstable." Silence swallowed the room completely. Even the ticking kitchen clock sounded loud. Ryan suddenly stood up, furious now. "You have no proof we abandoned you intentionally." I slid one final paper across the table toward him. Coast Guard navigation records showing the exact coordinates where I was rescued compared against the false route he reported afterward. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Ryan had nowhere left to hide. I stood up slowly and closed the folder. I sold the blue heron yesterday, I said quietly. My mother gasped in disbelief. And before anyone asks, every cent is protected through an irrevocable trust you cannot touch. My father finally spoke, his voice barely audible. You are really leaving your family over this? I looked at all three of them sitting beneath the warm dining room lights, pretending they did not recognize the monster they had become. Then I answered honestly. No, I said calmly. My family left me first. Then I walked out the front door without looking back while the sound of my mother crying echoed faintly through the house behind me.